You know how often we hear that phrase in the beginning? It's so simple, bud. It makes you think about how we all want to know where things came from. Today, we're going deep on one of the most famous beginnings, the Genesis creation account. We're looking at Genesis, everything from nothing, from My Christian Space. They call it the only plausible explanation. Let's see what that means.
What's interesting is how they start right off the bat with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth."
It's a powerful statement, gets right to the point.
Yeah, totally. No messing around. And they use the Hebrew Elohim, not just God. That always seemed interesting to me.
Yeah, it's an important detail. The source points out that Elohim is plural, which suggests that God is one and many. It might seem like a contradiction. But it shows how deep and complex the Christian idea of God is. So we had this idea of a God with many sides existing before everything else. And then there's that description. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. It's like the beginning of an epic movie.
Yeah, it's vivid. And the source wants us to look deeper than just the words. They talk about the Hebrew tohu wabohu, which means unformed and void. They say this wasn't empty space, it was chaotic emptiness, like a swirling nothingness.
So it's not just what existed, it's how things existed before creation.
Right. And here's something else. They connect this deep to Revelation 20, where the same word describes the abyss where Satan is imprisoned.
I never would have thought of that. It makes you think if there was already a conflict before light and order. What do you think about that?
It really makes you think. It suggests that creation wasn't just about the physical world, but a bigger fight between good and evil.
So we've got this chaotic void, this tohu wabohu, and then God says, "Let there be light." It's a huge moment in the story.
And the source emphasizes that God spoke creation into being. Throughout the account, we see the power of words. It's like this force that brings order.
It's interesting how important speech is. It's like how humans are made in God's image. And we use language to shape the world around us.
That's a great point. And talking about God's presence, the source introduces Shekinah here, which I think is a really beautiful concept.
Yeah, Shekinah has always seemed kind of mystical. How does the source explain it in this story?
They say Shekinah is God dwelling with us, and they see light as a way to represent that. So wherever there is light, there is a bit of God.
It's like how light in art and literature often represents knowledge, hope, even God.
Exactly. And it connects to another thing the source talks about, the order of creation. Genesis says, evening came before morning here.
Oh, right. It's different from how we usually think about time.
The source says this is because of the Jewish tradition of starting the day at sunset. It reminds us that our idea of time is affected by culture and religion.
It makes you realize we take a lot for granted in these stories. Before we talk about the sky and the waters, is there anything else about this light from verse 3 that's important? The source seems to think it's a big deal.
Right, they make a big deal about light. They actually point out that there are 2 different Hebrew words for light in this account.
Oh, really? I never noticed that. 2 different words.
Yeah, and they mean slightly different things. The first one, in verse 3, when God first makes light, that word is talking about the light that comes from God.
Like the very first light, totally pure.
That's it. But in verse 14, when he creates the sun and moon and stars, they use a different Hebrew word. That one's for things that reflect light.
So it's the difference between where light comes from and the things that show us the light.
You got it. And that goes back to something important the source keeps saying. God is where everything starts, but he uses other things to create, like the sun and moon.
It's like a hierarchy of light, God's light being at the top.
Interesting way to put it. And the source connects this light to the reason for creation. They say light, even reflected light, was made to help life go on even when God isn't right there.
That's deep. So even when we're apart from that first divine light, God gives us a way for life to keep growing.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next part of creation. God speaks, the water's separate, and there's the sky.
Such a strong image, splitting those huge spaces. And the source, again, talks about God speaking. It's like a magic spell, but, a million times stronger.
It is interesting how poetic the creation account is. And just like God speaks the world into being, we kind of do that too. Using words to build relationships, share thoughts, even just saying how we feel.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's like we have a little bit of that divine creativity inside us because of language.
Yeah.
And talking about being creative, things really get going from here. Land, plants, sun, moon, stars, creatures in the sea. birds. It's like a creation spree, all these different life forms.
It's true. Creation really speeds up here. Even with all that happening, the source finds meaning in the little things. Like they talk about the numbers that show up throughout the creation story.
Yeah, like how things are created in 3s or 4s or 5s. What's that all about?
Well, they're saying these numbers aren't random. 3 represents God's will, 4 is for trials and difficulties, and 5 means grace. So when you see those numbers in creation, it's like a hidden message about why things were made in that order.
It's like a code within the text. It's not just what he made, but when and in what order, because it all points to a bigger picture.
Right. It means we should look at the little things, the choices God makes as he creates.
That's so cool. Makes you want to read it again with fresh eyes, looking for those patterns.
Definitely. The text becomes so much more interesting when you look deeper.
And speaking of going deeper, we get to humans being created, probably the biggest moment in the whole story. Made in God's image, but what does that even mean?
The big question, right? The source really focuses on the Hebrew tselem, often translated as image, but they say it's closer to shadow.
Shadow. That's different. What is it getting at?
Well, what's a shadow? It shows the shape of something, but it isn't the thing itself.
I get it. So it's not about us looking like God, but about reflecting something deeper.
Exactly. And like a shadow needs its source. We can't really exist without God. We're reflections of him, made to be like him.
Like we're supposed to be reflections of God's light in the world.
Beautifully put. The source connects this to us being caretakers of creation, too.
Right. We're not just here to be here. We have to care for everything around us.
And that goes back to Tselem being God's representatives on earth. We're supposed to care for the world like God would, with love, wisdom, and responsibility.
It's a big job. It makes you think how what we do affects not only us, but the world God gave us.
For sure. And the source says this is tied to what happens to us ultimately, that will be judged on how well we cared for God's creation.
Makes you think. But before we get too serious, let's go back to the Garden of Eden. This source says God originally wanted humans to be vegetarian.
Yeah, they say that in Genesis chapter 1, God only gives plants and fruits as food for everyone, humans and animals.
No meat in paradise. Interesting, because today, meat is such a big part of our culture.
It's pretty different, yeah. They see that detail as proof that killing for food wasn't what God wanted at first. They even say that blood is life, meaning there's something sacred about life that we need to respect.
Fascinating. It makes you think about how humans and nature get along and how different that might have been in the beginning.
Definitely. Makes us question our ideas about how things have to be and imagine ways to live in harmony with nature.
So we've got this perfect picture humans living peacefully together and with all creatures, eating what the earth gives them. And after the 6th day, God looks at everything and says, it's very good. What did you think about how the source explained that phrase, very good?
You're right to focus on very good, because the source makes a big deal about it. It's not just like a thumbs up. It's God saying everything is perfect and complete.
Like, this is how I wanted it. But then, knowing what happens next, you'd have to wonder, if it was all very good, how'd it go so wrong?
The big question. And this source mostly focuses on the creation story itself. But it does kind of hint that God's plan is bigger than just this perfect beginning.
Let's just say there's more to it without giving us all the answers right now.
Right. They want us to keep thinking about those questions, to really dig into the mysteries of faith. It's like they're saying to understand God's plan, we have to look beyond just the events of creation and think about the deeper meaning in the text.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
They really focused on those number patterns, the light and darkness, even connecting the deep to that abyss in Revelation.
Exactly. All those details point to a bigger story, like a huge play that's way bigger than just those 7 days. It's like they're saying, don't just read what happened, think about what it all means.
It's like someone gave us this amazing tapestry and we're just starting to see the threads.
Love that. And as we look more at Genesis, we'll see how those threads come together to show us God, humans, and the world.
So true. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how you can know a text so well, but it can still surprise you.
Totally. Remind us there's always something new to learn, especially these ancient texts.
Okay, so for everyone listening, as we wrap up this look at Genesis with my Christian space, I want to leave you with something to think about. If God made a perfect world, peaceful, harmonious, with everything good in it, what does it mean that it didn't stay that way? What does that tell us about good and evil, free will, about how humans and God relate to each other?
Big questions. Hope you'll keep exploring them as you read the Bible and on your own faith journey.
Well said. And if this deep dive made you curious, come back next time when we'll keep exploring Genesis and find more amazing insights along the way.